You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 14th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
We are here because the Security Council asked us to be here. We respond to the Security Council, not to member states.
UN peacekeepers in Lebanon say that despite the deaths of their colleagues, they will not be leaving the country, as Benjamin Netanyahu has requested. Lithuania voted yesterday. We'll examine the likely results. We'll look at France's relationship with its former colonies in North Africa and...
I'm Gregory Scruggs, Monocle's Seattle correspondent, and I'll be filling you in on the latest news from Boeing.
We'll have a roundup of business news and a flick through the papers, and then we'll join our correspondent in Lisbon to learn how Portugal is attempting to stem the youth brain drain. That's all coming up right here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. China's military launched a new round of war games near Taiwan today, saying it was a warning to the separatist acts of Taiwan independence forces. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested that North Koreans are fighting alongside Russians in Ukraine, a theory that's backed by South Korea. And in Iceland, the Prime Minister says the coalition is effectively dysfunctional. He's disbanded the government and called a snap election. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, we begin in the Middle East with updates on Iran and Lebanon. Iran is bracing for retaliation from Israel and says it will do whatever is necessary to defend itself, whilst Lebanon is in the midst of an Israeli retaliation. Israel, too, is braced for further attacks from Iran, and the US has now said it will deploy an anti-ballistic missile system and the crew to operate it to bolster the country's air defence system. Well, I'm joined now by Negin Shiragia, who is a former presenter at the BBC's Persian service, and Lindsay Hilsum, author and Channel 4 News International editor in Beirut. Negin, if we could begin with the Iranian foreign minister's comments on Sunday. He said we have no red lines in defending our people and interests. He met with his Iraqi counterpart, who said Baghdad was against an expansion of the Middle East war to Iran. What else came out of that meeting?
Good morning. It looks like Iran is continuously sending double messages. So at the same time, the foreign minister is pushing the narrative that they're going to continue pursuing any diplomatic way that is possible. And even this morning, there was another briefing that he kind of persisted on that. And at this moment, Ghalibaf, the head of the Iran's Majlis, which is the parliament in Iran, is in Geneva and, been talking to the head of the Emirates, United Arab Emirates parliament as well, to pursue any kind of diplomatic way that is possible. And that mixed messaging exists inside the country as well. So on the streets of Tehran, you see this billboard that showcases, the head of the states and, Ghalibaf and the head of foreign ministry going into war in a way, but then at the same time saying they're pursuing diplomacy. I think Iran is right now, they're trying to prevent the war at any cost possible. But at the same time, they don't want to look weak. And that's why they're trying to send a strong message in wording, at least, to say if anything happens, they're going to pursue any. But I think for me, looking at the region right now and what's happening, the proxy war continues, and the trip to Iraq can be looked at in that context. And because one thing that people forget is any war is costly. And Iran needs money, and Iran is highly sanctioned. And what's happened in Lebanon, and what happened in Syria over the weekend, what happened with targeting Iran's proxy in the region, means that Iran is losing it's financial gaining from using these proxies, because these proxies are not only for war or military purposes. Iran has been using these proxies to continuously going around the sanctions, moving monies, using it for illicit operations around drugs, trafficking, and that sort of things. So Iran needs these proxies for financial gains as well. And that put Iran in a really complicated situation right now.
Of course, one of the main proxies is Hezbollah in Lebanon. Lindsay, you're in Beirut. What happened there over the weekend?
Well, there's been a lot of activity. I arrived on Thursday night, and as I arrived, I landed, I could smell the smoke because there were two enormous explosions in the middle of the city. And we went the next day, and what has happened is that Hezbollah leaders and members who were sort of concentrated in certain areas have spread out across the city and across the country. And they are now anywhere, and Israel is tracking them and targeting them. So this is terrifying for ordinary Lebanese, because they don't know who is necessarily amongst them. And so there was complete destruction there. And over those 24 hours, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, 168 people were injured and 60 killed. And a lot of those were civilians, including a family of 8. Now, down in the south, which is where Israel has invaded to some extent, sent its troops across, and we're not really clear whether the troops just are staying or going back and coming again. There's fighting going on, but there's really no information. The only eyes and ears on the ground, you could say, are from the UN peacekeepers there, UNIFIL. But Israel is doing everything it can to get rid of UNIFIL. These are 10,000 peacekeepers from 50 different countries, including Italy, Ireland, there's Sri Lanka, Indonesia, all sorts of countries. They have no right. They don't take part in the fighting. They cannot stop Israel from invading, and they cannot stop Hezbollah from firing into Israel, which it has continued to do. But Israel has been attacking the UNIFIL base and telling UNIFIL, the UN soldiers, that they need to retreat further back because they don't want them there. Now, they say that if they stay there, that they are there as hostages of Hezbollah. That is not how the UN sees it. The UNIFIL spokesman who I was talking to, it says that they are there as observers to see what is going on and to report to the Security Council. And for the moment, although 5 of them have been injured, they are not leaving.
If we could go back to Negin, I wonder if we're looking at sort of foreign involvement here. How might Iran react to the deployment of the US anti-ballistic missile system to Israel and the fact that a crew is being sent to operate it? I mean, does this ratchet up the tension even more, given that there will be American boots on the ground?
It definitely sends a strong signal to Iran. I was monitoring the reaction inside the country, in the Persian media inside, and it looks like they're trying to downplay it. They're saying, this kind of the thought wouldn't be able to prevent hypersonic missiles to reach Israel. And Fatah, which is one of the missiles Iran has, is much more stronger. And this is not going to be preventative. Iran's going to be victorious. And that language, whenever it's out there, shows that there's a lot of worries behind it. It's a sign of real worry on Iran's side. And I think that kind of escalate the situation in Iranians' mind. But at the same time, what are their options? What can they do? Because Iran, for years and years, they've been using the proxies more than anything else. And even when you look at the attack on Israel, they've been trying to make sure that the Israelis know about it, the US is warned about it, kind of containing the situation. And up to this moment, I don't see any sign from the Iranian side of things to want to escalate the situation. They've been trying to contain it. And I think that would be the policy, at least for the moment. There is no sign showing anything else, especially the sanctions on the ghost ships, oil ghost ships that the US put in place just before the weekend. That's another escalation for Iran, because that's another way of Iran's financial gain that they're losing it. And the reaction to that was even stronger than the reaction to the thought missile prevention system.
Lindsay, last week Israel's Prime Minister gave a speech urging the Lebanese people to take their country back from Hezbollah. I wonder if there's a sense in Beirut that there's been a shift in Israel's aims. Could it now be that Netanyahu wants to effect political change in Lebanon rather than attacking Hezbollah's presence?
Well, I think definitely they listen to that, and they listen to the Americans saying this is an opportunity for Lebanon and so on. Lebanon is a very weak state, and it has no effective government. And that is partly because of outside powers and partly because of internal political reasons. At the end of the Civil War, basically, this is a very small country with 17 different confessions or sects. And the way the politics is divided up is into those different sects, so the Druze and the Maronite Christians and the Shia and the Sunni and so on. And it stumbles along. And some people are very angry at Hezbollah and feel that Hezbollah, by fighting against Israel, is dragging everybody into this conflict. And that's what a lot of the Christian politicians feel. But others say that even if they don't support Hezbollah as a political grouping, and they don't like the fact that it is armed and it is a militia, it's basically an army within the state, which is not the national army, say, well, at least they are resisting Israel, and we should all resist Israel. So there are a lot of different points of view here, and it's very hard to see that a crisis like that and being invaded is what is going to solve Lebanon's political problems. But certainly what you see here is a very weak state, a very weak army, a very weak police force, very weak politicians. None of them are able to resist Israel. And it's so interesting hearing people talking about Iron Shield and this new defense shield which the Americans are going to bring into Israel. I was talking to some Lebanese friends last night, and they were saying, I wish we could have some kind of shield. Nobody provides us with any shield. And that's absolutely true, that when Israeli missiles come in, no one is protecting the Lebanese from them, even the Lebanese, or in fact, mainly the Lebanese, who are not Hezbollah.
Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. That's Lindsay Hilsum there in Beirut. And we were also speaking to Negin Shiragi. This is The Globalist. It's 9:12 in Vilnius, 7:12 here in London. A national election took place in Lithuania yesterday. Ahead of the vote, opinion polls showed the Social Democrats ahead with about 18% support, while Homeland Union was third with 9%, behind the anti-establishment Nemunas Dawn Party on 12%. There are about 2.4 million voters in the country, and there will be a second round of voting on October the 27th. Well, I'm joined now by Liudis Dapkus, who is a freelance reporter for AP News in Vilnius. Liudis, good morning to you. Many thanks for joining us. Do we have any results from the election yet?
Good morning. Yes, indeed. Actually, the half of the parliament has been elected already, and the reality showed that the opinion polls were not quite right, but they were showing the right direction. So we have Social Democrats leading, obviously, but not as strongly as it was expected before, with 18 mandates already won. But the current ruling party, the Conservatives or Homeland Union, they have 17, only one mandate less. So this newly established party fell with 14%, which means that probably the Social Democrats, if they are successful in the second round, which will take place in 2 weeks, they might think of the coalition with two another center-left parties, which are also made into the parliament, while the colleagues of the current three-party ruling coalition, one of them, it did not even make into the parliament, the Liberal, the Freedom Party, and also the Liberals, they made it into, but only with 7 seats.
So Lithuania has seen an annual double-digit personal income growth. It has one of the lowest inflation rates in the EU. Why then are the people seemingly not happy with Homeland Union?
Well, it's a complex of the reasons, one of them being that people don't associate their personal wealth increase or rapidly increasing capabilities in economic life with any deeds, goodwill of the government. And the government was really bombarded with several crises, including the one which started when they took in 2020 with COVID, and this was one of the harshest, measures in entire EU. And also what followed this orchestrated immigrant crisis from Belarus and all those things that happened afterwards. So people were tired of constant crisis, sometimes blaming government for that. But as we see from the results, it's not as terrible as it used to show in our opinion polls anyway.
What have the Social Democrats promised?
Well, they promised to raise wages and lower taxes as usual, which is liked by many people. Of course, that's a sarcasm, but they actually didn't do much, and they were just waiting for a ruling coalition to kill itself by some kind of harsh rhetorics and this tiredness of dealing with a pretty intense 4 years term.
Now, we've seen a rise in the far right in many places in Europe. Is that the case in Lithuania too?
Indeed, it was an influx of new parties created, and some of them openly pro-Russian and advocating that Lithuania shouldn't be as strict on help to Ukraine and as opposing to Moscow regime. But none of them made it into the parliament at all. Not even a single mandate or whatever. So it can be considered a bit strange in terms of European direction, because Lithuania is obviously shifting to the left, but that left is also more liberal than the rest. So it's not a major shift, and no changes in foreign policy can be expected as well.
What is Lithuania's main foreign policies?
Well, the main foreign policies which stand out from, for example, European policies is an extremely harsh stance against China, for example. Lithuania was one of the few countries in the world which has embassy of Taiwan, not just economical, but also political. So the ties with China are severed. Basically, no ambassadors for 4 years in none of the countries here. And China tried to react economically by imposing certain sanctions, but it didn't go well. So it might change a little in that sense, at least in rhetorics, probably by Social Democrats and their partners. But in Lithuania, the foreign policy is determined mainly by the president, and he is pretty obviously is pro-Ukrainian and very anti-Russian, so it's not going to change in that direction.
And finally, is there any suggestion of Russian interference in this election?
Yes, of course. There were parties which were playing just like on Moscow playbook, saying there must be a ceasefire, peaceful negotiations, and stop arming Ukrainians. But as I said, none of those new established parties were interesting to the voters, and they got probably something like 0 point something results. Lithuania is very concerned about the security issues, and security issues were one of the dominating, but most of those 6 parties which made into the parliament, all of them are more or less on the same direction in this.
Liudas, thank you very much indeed. That's Liudas Dapkus there, speaking to us from Vilnius. Now, still to come on the programme.
The French have tended to have all too often a condescending attitude. There's a certain Parisian elite which seems to think that if you live within more than 2 miles of the Seine River in the centre of Paris, you don't know what North Africa is. And this has led to some basic miscalculations.
This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS, all around the world.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio is Theo Usherwood, who's a political journalist and broadcaster. Welcome, Theo.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Now, we're looking at Donald Trump. I mean, I don't really know where to start with this story because he had this rally in which he was just pretty outrageous. And then there was possibly an assassination attempt. We don't know. It's all very confusing.
Shall we start with the assassination attempt that wasn't an assassination attempt, or could have been an assassination attempt? It relates to a man called Vem Miller, who managed, and this was at the Coachella rally Trump rally and it's an interesting one because this is in a blue state, right, in California, and he manages to get past the first checkpoint, where he claimed to have which checks for media, VIP credentials, and then is spotted on his way to the rally in an SUV which apparently had some problems with its number plates, gets stopped by a local deputy, and they find a handgun and a shotgun as well as various passports and fake documents, driver's licenses, and he's insisting that he's an artist. Apparently he had no intention of assassinating Donald Trump, but the deputies, as part of the Coachella Police Department, are very pleased with themselves. They've stopped a third assassination attempt. There's no doubt that this was what Vem Miller was going to do. Trump's distancing himself from any claims that he survived or a third assassination attempt has been thwarted, because of course we had the one at his Palm Beach golf club where there was Ruth was hiding in the bushes and about to take pot shots at him or at his golf club, and then of course what happened back in Butler, Pennsylvania, which that was the actual assassination attempt. But I think it speaks to this it speaks to this idea, and of course Trump's playing it down, that with just over 3 weeks to go until the US election, these rallies are being tightly controlled, and there is potentially a real threat against Donald Trump's life, and the police are feeling the pressure from it as well, of course, as the Secret Service, because they came under significant pressure as a result of what happened back in Butler, Pennsylvania, where they didn't stop the shooter from taking aim at his target, which was Donald Trump.
Of course, Trump himself is threatening people, though. At the very same rally, he sort of was almost urging the crowd to lynch a heckler.
Yes, so it was this heckler who was giving Trump, criticising Trump, shouting out at Trump at this rally, and Trump then chimes in saying, "Go back home to mummy." She goes back home to mummy. What was that, you darling? And she gets the hell knocked out of her. Her mother's a big fan of ours, you know that, right? Her mother, her father, her mother. You always have that. Which of course this isn't the first time that he's done it, and this comes as a week at the end of a week where he said he'd been to Gaza but hadn't been to Gaza, called for CBS's broadcasting license to be suspended, and he's resorting increasingly to these, to playing to the base and for going for the most incendiary, the most inflammatory comments. And of course that would signal that if he is going for the base, that he's feeling the pressure and things are really getting tightening, so tight between him and Harris.
Absolutely. Let's go to Europe now, and the German opposition says that stricter asylum rules will rescue the Schengen zone. This is from the Times.
Yes, this is an interesting story, actually. It's regarding a man called Thorsten Frey, who's the chief whip of the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union Party, and in Germany. And of course, they've got a 12-point lead going into ahead of next September's elections. And there's a tendency when you're looking at the pressure that European countries are facing from migrants travelling from North Africa, from the Middle East, and of course as far as Afghanistan and Vietnam, to see it in a sort of singular, encapsulated in one country at a time. And actually these are pressures that the whole of Western Europe are facing. And Olaf Scholz's government's facing it. There's been, that his government, Scholz's government, his coalition government is teetering on the brink. Could it even, not make it through to September? And Thorsten Frey said, actually, hang on a moment. If we come in as, the right wing, as a right wing government, we need to deal with the Schengen area. And the claim, what he's suggesting, and this is something that Hungary's already done, Poland's looking at doing, is in effect suspending large parts of the Schengen agreement, which allows free movement of people within the Eurozone, and saying actually Germany must have the right to turn back migrants at its border. And will that then consequentially put pressures on other countries within the EU to take those migrants? He's also saying that he's looking at an offshore centre for migrants, similar to what Rishi Sunak was planning to introduce. Boris Johnson originally came up with the idea to offshore migrants in places like Rwanda as well.
Very interesting, and interesting to see how it's going to affect the rest of Europe. Let's have a look at Iceland now, a snap election.
Yes, this was announced last night by Benediktsson, the Prime Minister, Bjarni Benediktsson, the Prime Minister in Iceland. And this is an interesting one because he obviously took power back in April because the then Prime Minister wanted to run for president, and he was running a coalition. The coalition has now collapsed. Again, I mean, the details haven't come out, exactly what led to the collapse of the government. But again, one of the issues cited in the Reuters article was the fact that there was disagreements with the coalition partners about the issue of asylum seekers, asylum claims in Iceland. This at the same time, of course, as there's high inflation, high interest rates, after the eruption of a volcano back in January, which we've seen 4,000 people evacuated from their homes in Iceland, which of course put further pressure on the economy. And he's now called a snap election for the end of November, and to try and resolve the issue one way or another, because the government can't pass muster.
I mean, the joke about Iceland is often that the population is so small that at some point everybody has a go at being in the government. Finally, let's go to Paris, and this is a row about historic monuments.
Yes, this is again from the Times. This is a fascinating story, and I have to say, when I looked at it, and I don't try not to hold an opinion too often, but I had some sympathy with the Socialist Council in Paris, and increasingly they've got this, having to spend millions of pounds. This is a council that's £8 million in debt, having to spend millions of pounds to upkeep, historic monuments. And Paris is a stunning city, and it's got, churches, monuments, spanning back hundreds of years, and they need to maintain them. And how are they paying to maintain them without turning again to the taxpayers in Paris? Well, now they're coming up with the idea, and this goes back to a relaxation in the planning rules, goes back to 2007, and they're allowing luxury brands to put their logos, their photographs across the scaffolding when these monuments are being restored, to raise millions of pounds, whether it's Gucci or Prada or whatever, in order to pay for the monuments. But there are those, of course, it being Paris, who are very sceptical and saying, especially environmentalists, who are saying, hang on a moment, this isn't, it should be taxpayers that are paying for this. We shouldn't see our historic monuments in this city be turned into advertising hoardings for luxury brands. It isn't Parisian.
And this is particularly sparked off by the Saint Michel fountain,
yes.
And who they've signed a contract. As you say, with an advertiser, but this particular fountain is designed by some great architect, Gabriel Davieux, I think.
Yes.
People.
Yeah, and it's not the first time, because Francois Pinault, who's the luxury goods magnate, whose assets include Gucci, he paid €1.5 million towards the cost of renovating the Virgin Chapel of Saint-Sulpice, which was completed last month, and he did it precisely by by providing this advertising. Yeah, and in the Saint Michel fountain in the Latin Quarter, £2.3 million has been paid for, thanks to advertising, and it's going to be completed in 2026. But until 2026, if you're going to visit Paris and you want to see the Saint Michel fountain, then you're going to have to look at the luxury goods or the luxury branding of whoever has got the advertising at that particular time. But it's a novel way to fund these projects. And of course, Sadiq Khan in London has came up with a similar idea that actually got shot down, which was to name tube stations potentially after particular brands, and that brands would pay in order to have their names associated with underground stations in London. People didn't generally like that idea, and it didn't pass. It hasn't come into be.
Because of course, when you look at Notre Dame and the restoration of that, there was a huge outpouring of funds from the public. I mean, people really wanted to help.
Yes, but Notre Dame, of course, is the centrepiece in Paris, or one of the a few centrepieces in Paris. Paris, like London, has many beautiful buildings, and of course, can every building be funded by the taxpayer? Can the council turn around at every single point and say, oh, we need more money for this project and more money for that project? And clearly they've had to look at, I love the idea of a socialist government turning determinedly pro-capitalist in order to get themselves out of trouble with these.
Theo, thank you very much indeed. That's Theo Usherwood. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. China's military launched a new round of war games near Taiwan today, saying it was a warning to the separatist acts of Taiwan independence forces, drawing condemnation from the Taipei and US governments. The drills are seen as a response to a speech by Taiwanese President William Lai last week, in which he vowed to resist annexation by Beijing. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested that North Koreans are fighting alongside Russians in Ukraine. The theory was supported by South Korea's defense minister, who said reports of North Korean deaths in a strike on Russian-held positions inside Ukraine were likely true. And Iceland has called a snap election, and the Prime Minister has disbanded the government. He blamed a crumbling coalition that he said was effectively dysfunctional. Elections must now be held within 45 days. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Algeria's President Tebboune has once again postponed a much-anticipated trip to Paris in a sign that relations between France and its one-time colony are further deteriorating. And Algeria is hardly the only North African nation that's shed its relationship with France of late. To find out why France is struggling to maintain influence in North Africa, Monocle's Chris Chermak spoke with Francis Gilles, a journalist and long-time North Africa correspondent for the Financial Times, currently living in Paris. Chris began by asking Francis about how France perceives its former North African colonies today.
Well, I think France suffers from, vis-a-vis North Africa and vis-a-vis its former colonies in Black Africa, because this explains the Mali debacle and all that, is that it continues to look upon these territories with not always but often neo-colonial eyes. In other words, the French establishment, and there are exceptions, but their voices aren't often heard, don't seem to have quite registered that since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the world has changed, that you can no longer treat former colonial countries as you did for many decades after they became independent in the 1960s, that the rise of China, the role of South Africa, the role of India, the rise of Brazil, all these are features of modern international relations which matter. So the French have tended to have all too often a condescending attitude, and also to think that they alone knew the Maghreb countries. There's a certain Parisian elite which seems to think that if you live within more than 2 miles of the Seine River in the centre of Paris, you don't know what North Africa is. And this has led to some basic miscalculations. Now, certain things are constant with North Africa. The French elites tend to be more favourable to Morocco than to Algeria. It's partly a result of the bitter war of liberation of Algeria fought in the 50s and early 60s. It's partly the fact that Morocco conducts its diplomacy, its soft diplomacy, much more cleverly than Algeria, which doesn't really bother. Nonetheless, the French have been happy to see North Africa divided. Algeria, Morocco, it's been a very difficult relationship for decades now, symbolised by the disagreement over the future of the Western Sahara, a former Spanish colony. But this argument has been going on now for 49 years. And there's no solution in sight, at least in terms of international law.
And yet, if I could jump in on that, it's interesting that only quite recently the French and Emmanuel Macron have actually declared that they are somewhat on the side of Morocco when it comes to Western Sahara. They were more neutral before that.
They were neutral, but always with a bias towards Morocco. The only country which tried to broker a serious negotiation on the Western Sahara were the Americans at the turn of the century. Their efforts were seriously made. They came to nothing. But the French never made any effort seriously to try and bring the two parties together. And it suited the French. And in Brussels, until recently, what the French wanted on North Africa, they got. But today, France is a much weaker country economically. It's a much weaker country because its voice is not heard with much respect in the Middle East or in Russia. The French Foreign Office has become neocon in the American sense. And the president we have, whatever his qualities par ailleurs, is not a practitioner of international diplomacy on a par with Dominique de Villepin, the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Jacques Chirac, or some of the other great foreign ministers we've had in the Fifth Republic.
Is part of the problem of President Macron when it comes to North Africa, or other places for that matter, that he does tend to send some mixed signals often. He is trying to be the great diplomat, and when it comes to, for example, Algeria, he did have a meeting with Algeria's president, the G7. There was a sort of warming of relations, and yet then, as we were just mentioning, he now sides with Morocco on the Western Sahara. He's trying to kind of have it both ways, and therefore losing influence, isn't he?
Well, he switched positions on the West Sahara last summer, essentially to say that Morocco's autonomy plan on the Western Sahara, which is one of a number of plans on the Western Sahara, was the best, which means he's moving towards Morocco. But he's doing this purely because in the next year or two there are some major contracts, notably the fast train between Casablanca and Marrakesh. So if he wants to have a chance for French companies winning these contracts, the Moroccans are playing hardball. And the Spanish moved 2 years ago because the Moroccans opened the floodgates of the towns which Spain owns on the northern coast of Morocco to illegal immigrants, and the Spanish had to give in. Now the French are giving in, so the Moroccans are playing their cards well. And of course the Algerians, who support an independent Western Sahara, were furious. But then the Algerians have their own reasons for playing hardball with France. Some of them are very serious. For instance, there were nuclear experiments, a treaty between 1960, 2 years before Algeria became independent, and 1966. The sites where these nuclear atomic bombs were dropped were never been cleaned up, and the people who were never compensated, the French and the Algerians, who in those days were French, were never compensated. So this is a very difficult file, because if it's opened, it's going to be very expensive, but it's very difficult not to open it if you really want to clean up your relationship with Algeria. The Algerian leadership tends to play an anti-French game because it's a way of buttressing its support with the population to whom it's denying democracy.
Well, and we've seen this actually quite recently with the president going to France to actually have a meeting with Emmanuel Macron and then continuing to postpone it. Again, just the last few days saying he will not go because it's seen as sort of some kind of groveling for them to go to Paris, just the very fact of going for a diplomatic summit.
It must be said, in recent months, French politicians, including members of the government, have said things about Algeria which are particularly harsh. And the former Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin intervened on French radio to say, Algeria is a great nation. They should be our friends. The way we treat Algeria doesn't make sense in terms of our own interests. But there are very few voices in France who speak in this way. And as a result, France is losing ground in Algeria. They're criticizing the Tunisian president, rightly or wrongly, for the measures he's taking against the opposition. So I think this is bound to continue until we have a president who is able to articulate a strategy. Not easy, but if you don't articulate a strategy about the whole region, then you end up by playing a kind of mad game of football. You're all over the floor, basically. That's what's happening.
The journalist Francis Gilles there in conversation with Monocle's Chris Chermak. You're with Monocle Radio. We're heading to Seattle now, the home of the beleaguered global aerospace company Boeing, which announced the loss of 17,000 jobs on Friday. Boeing's stock has dropped 40% this year, wiping $60 billion from its market value, and the plane manufacturer is facing many other challenges. Gregory Scruggs is Monocle's Seattle correspondent and joins me now. Greg, if we could start with this huge retrenchment exercise, around 10% of jobs are to be axed. Tell us more.
Well, Boeing is now past the 30-day mark of this machinist strike. So 33,000 of the rank and file who actually build the airplanes walked off the job a month ago and brought much of the commercial production to a screeching halt. Boeing has been bleeding cash as a result, and something had to give. In this case, 10% of the workforce. It's going to be affecting up and down the chain, executives, managers, likely everyday workers as well, engineers certainly. And it comes as a belt-tightening exercise because Boeing doesn't know when the strike is going to end. Both sides are dug in. Talks have broken down multiple times since the strike began. And remember, previous strikes have gone on not just weeks, but months.
Greg, I understand that this union strike has grown pretty contentious. What's the latest?
Well, the two key sticking points are wages and pensions. And the wages, there's wiggle room there, but I think the pensions are more of a tougher nut to crack because that incurs long-term financial obligations for Boeing. But it's also something that cuts really deeply for the machinists. They lost their pensions in a labor deal 10 years ago, and the older workers, as new employees come on, new machinists, they tell them, you may not have a pension right now, but you're entitled to one. We had one. We're going to fight to get it back. So there's been this culture of wanting to be taken care of in the long haul, that Boeing was a company you worked for once upon a time, that it wasn't just a job. It was a career that took care of you even after retirement. And the old guard who really run the union and keep that flame alight don't want to just give up on that wholesale.
Boeing's caught up in a number of court cases. Relatives of the victims of the two Boeing 737 MAX planes that crashed have objected to Boeing's agreement to plead guilty to conspiring to defraud regulators. Has there been a ruling on that?
Not as of yet, but a federal judge in Fort Worth, Texas, held a hearing on Friday looking very closely at this settlement between the U.S. Department of Justice and Boeing. The victims the victims' families, who've been very vocal advocates on behalf of their deceased relatives, they were calling on the judge to reject what they're calling a sweetheart plea deal. And it did seem on Friday he had some tough questions for federal prosecutors here, asking whether or not this was truly sufficient punishment for Boeing. The terms of the deal were to pay up to $487.2 million in fines and spend another $455 million on improving safety and compliance practices over 3 years of court-supervised probation. But again, given the scale of these disasters in 2018, that really shook global confidence in Boeing and to some extent the aviation sector more widely, there is a possibility the judge may say, no, you need to go back to the drawing board.
Now, the company's due to post third quarter results on October the 23rd. It's really not looking good, is it?
No, it's not. The earnings call is on October 23rd, and certainly Boeing is trying to get the news out a bit early so that doesn't go over any more of a lead balloon than it already will. I mean, they had a negative. They're projecting a negative operating cash flow of $1.3 billion for the third quarter, which is translating into a loss per share of almost $10. And I'm sure investors will not be happy.
So how is this impacting the first delivery of the new 777X, which was initially due to enter commercial service back in 2020?
Delayed yet again. What a surprise. Concurrent with the announcement of the job cuts we spoke about earlier, Boeing said there will be yet another year delay to the 777X, which is its answer to the Airbus A350. So that delivery now slips to 2026. And inshallah, we'll see when it actually starts flying. And Boeing also axed its 767 freighter program. Both of those are made in Washington state by the striking machinists, although the freighter was really already on its way out due to some new ICAO regulations coming into effect.
So the global credit rating agency, S&P, has put Boeing on credit watch. What does that mean for the company's long-term future? I mean, can it survive if downgraded?
Given the nature of Boeing, as it's not a state-owned company, of course, in the U.S., but it does have this kind of preferential status. A large part of its revenue comes from defense contracts with the Pentagon. The U.S. Import-Export Bank functions to a large extent to make Boeing aircraft exportable abroad in terms of sort of the tariffs and loans and that sort of thing. I do think Boeing is too big to fail. They do have this new CEO, Kelly Ortberg. He's been cleaning house a bit. He did fire the head of the defense division. So it does seem like the wake-up call has come, but this is a bad year that still somehow keeps getting worse for Boeing.
And Greg, just before you go, where did it all start going wrong? I wondered if it could be traced back to the late 90s following its merger with McDonnell Douglas. The CEO who came in then, he was Harry Stonecipher. He was determined to prioritise speed, to cut costs, to enhance shareholder value. He appears to have done exactly the opposite.
Yes, the old guard Boeing folks here, and I've spoken with some of them, reporting I've done for Monocle Radio earlier this year in the run-up to the strike. Everybody seems to pin Boeing's downward fortunes on the merger with McDonnell Douglas. That although Boeing kept the name, it seems as though McDonnell Douglas really took over the C-suite and upper management, and replacing engineers with accountants is the criticism that many here in the Boeing alumni community make, that so-called bean counters don't know how to build airplanes like engineers do, and 30 years later that's really coming home to roost in the worst possible way.
Greg, thanks very much indeed. That was Gregory Scruggs in Seattle. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's time now to talk business with Isabel Hamilton, who's a senior reporter at the Daily Upside. Welcome back, Isabel.
Hello.
Now, we're going to start off with a story that's reported in the Financial Times. It's about social media groups and doing more against financial fraud on their sites.
Yes, this was an interview that the FT had, and it was an interview with the interim head of the payment systems regulator here in the UK. And he suggested that exactly what you said, social media companies should bear a bit more responsibility when someone gets scammed via one of their platforms. And it's part of this sort of ongoing conversation about whether social media platforms or telecoms companies should really be taking some of the financial burden when someone, is approached by a scammer on their platforms.
So, I mean, last week there were new rules that came in to make payment providers liable for losses to authorise push payment fraud. But that's only up to about £85,000.
Yes, originally I think they had it slated for about 415,000, but that has been cut. The regulator said that there's, good reason for that. They looked into it, and most scams tap out around £85,000. But there is some criticism that this is a sort of watering down by the government after lobbying from the payment companies themselves.
Now, earlier in the programme, we were talking about Boeing and their strike, which has now gone on for weeks and weeks. And they're not alone. There's a big piece all about, this is in the Wall Street Journal, about some really big strikes in the US and how the unions are defying their leadership, voting no on contracts.
Yes, I think this is really interesting because last year we had some massive strikes. We had the Hollywood strikes, we had the United Auto Workers strike, and they were really big, but they didn't have this element of leadership coming to the members saying, we've got the best deal we think we can get, here you go, and members saying, no thanks, try again. So this sets the stage for more union negotiations. They're actually really intractable. And the Wall Street Journal noted that this is partially because union members in the US tend to make more than workers who aren't in a union, but they're seeing the sort of average wage shrink because there's been so much inflation, post-pandemic, and a lot of union members got locked into multi-year deals. So that's why they're pushing a little bit harder.
The article also talks about how sometimes leaders have strategic reasons for putting forward a deal they suspect their members will reject.
Yeah, this is something that people can do. Union leaders can take a deal back to the members, expecting that the members will say no, and then that leads to, heaped pressure, let's say, on management. But in the case of the Boeing deal, I think they got something like a 25% wage increase, and the members were looking for 40. So, yeah, the members are really holding out.
Finally, let's go to space, or in fact just to Milan, where all the space powers are gathering, apart from Russia, of course.
Yeah, so this is the International Aeronautical Congress. It's been running since 1950, and it's a sort of industry meetup. And with space sort of exploration and activity in general, industry is becoming a more and more key word because there's more and more sort of private companies involved. This meeting, this convention is kicking off right after SpaceX managed to catch one of its rocket boosters after launching a rocket. That's a really big step for private companies because being able to reuse parts of rockets is a major, major sort of puzzle piece that they need to make them more affordable and cost efficient.
So I think there's 77 member countries of this IAF. And even with all this conflict in the world, you've got, apart from Russia, you've got all of these people in the same room together and trying to come up with global solutions.
Absolutely. Although I would say that there is still an element of geopolitical tension. One of the big sort of themes at this year's IAC is going to be Europe having sovereign access to space. And that's because it doesn't want to be reliant on US private companies or indeed the US itself to access space. It wants to be able to launch its own satellites, launch its own astronauts. There is an element of everyone feeling they need their own homegrown industry.
Isabel, thank you very much. That's Isabel Hamilton there, and you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. In Portugal, the centre-right minority government of Luís Montenegro wants to slash taxes for the under-35s in order to make staying at home and working in Portugal more attractive to youngsters who've been leaving the country for better wages and working conditions abroad. Gaia Lutz is Monocle's Lisbon correspondent. She joins us on the line now. Hello to you, Gaia.
Hi, Georgina. Good morning.
What's the scale of this problem?
So, Georgina, immigration is not new in Portugal. Portugal has long been a country of immigrants, with an estimated 1/4 of its population of roughly 10 million leaving the country. This is, however, the highest rate in the European Union. And the latest data from Portugal's Immigration Observatory points to 850,000 young people between 15 and 39 years old leaving the country altogether. But although this phenomenon is not new, Georgina, Portugal has changed significantly over the years, It has recovered, of course, from a fledgling economy after years of recession by mainly convincing foreigners this is a country worth investing in. And still, it has not managed to convince its own locals. And the brain drain continues. Added to that, new pressures have contributed to further aggravate the situation. Soaring rents, house prices, combined with a stagnant minimum wage, have hit the youth particularly hard. So in cities like Lisbon or Porto, it's increasingly harder for a young person to leave their parents' house. And many feel it's altogether too hard to stay in these cities and even the country.
So what's the government's proposal?
So under the new youth income tax scheme, which is named the IRS Jovem, those aged 35 or younger would pay no taxes on income up to 28,000 euros in their first year of work. Then the tax burden would progressively increase over 10 years. So it would go from 75%, 50, 25, etc. in a 10-year program altogether. And although the move has attracted significant attention, both internationally and here, it's not really new. The initiative is actually an adjustment to what's already currently in place, which was introduced by the prior socialist government. So the adjustment sort of widens the tax breaks from 5 to 10 years, and it also removes the necessity of a university degree for those benefited. But in broadening the scheme, the government predicts that around 400,000 young people could benefit from it.
And is this fiscally responsible? What does the IMF say?
So the IMF has issued a statement that expresses both skepticism and caution at the program. The body has questioned the effectiveness of age-based tax cuts in stemming immigration, and also warned that the plan could jeopardize Portugal's fiscal stability. The project cost of youth tax breaks could, according to the IMF, strain the country's ability to reduce its public debt, and also sort of maintaining the necessary public investment. Further, it's also not at all that clear whether the budget will be approved in Parliament. The vote is on the 31st, and the government is in a rather frail coalition. So we'll have to see if that will go through at all.
I mean, is there still skyrocketing inflation, the cost of living in Portugal? Is that still going up?
Yes, that's still going up. And so I think a lot of critics, or even people who find this program sensible, but also critics stress that it's important that it sort of comes with broader reforms. So it's not really. I mean, there's the link between lower taxes and retaining talent is not as direct or simple. So in fact, it has to come with other ways to retain talent. So minimum wage is always mentioned, the housing crisis, and still, tax breaks sometimes benefit employers more than employees. And it's not that clear whether employers will react by making jobs more competitive, or perhaps in hiring more people, or investing in buying equipment or resources. So I think a lot of critics are skeptical about this, but either way, it's become very clear for all parties, I think, that form government at the moment, be it the center-right or the socialists, that there's no escape from addressing these matters if they want to remain in power. And
Gaia, this directly affects your age group. What are your friends saying? Are you all going to stay? Are you going to go?
I think after a lot of, it affects our age group, but I think after a lot of years where the government was very focused, as I was mentioning, in bringing foreign investment into the country, rather than benefiting quality of life for locals, there's this lingering feeling among some sectors of too little, too late, Georgina. So I think people are feeling that it will take much more than tax exemptions to reverse the tides when it comes to immigration. So I think first of all, people are talking about career opportunities. Is there a chance for progression? Are salaries going to increase even if our tax burden decreases? So I think there's a lot of talk about a sort of a broader problem rather than just a simple solution. Although I have to say this is very welcome. Of course, any government that is, first of all, talking about decreasing taxes. Yes. A lot of people don't complain about that. And then secondly, that they're taking seriously a problem that affects so many young people, of course, is welcome. It's just a matter of fact of seeing it as a part of a broader whole of public policy.
Gaia, thank you very much indeed. That's Gaia Lutz there. And that's all we've got time for. Thanks to our producers, Chris Chamak and Monica Lillis, our researcher, George Ruskin, and our studio manager, Mariella Bevan. The briefing is live at midday in London, and The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.